Good afternoon. Thanks for being here at this faculty colloquium. Today we have one of our many newer, exciting professors on campus who was most recently introduced by Board of Trustee member Skip Rutherford as Beacon. Connell, take it away.
All right, thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. So this is obviously going to be a discussion on public opinion as it relates to immigration policy and refugee policy. Before I hop into the lecture, I figured let me just introduce myself and just kind of what I study and my broader research interest. So I study something called international political economy, which is a mouthful, so we call it IPE for short. And IPE scholars are primarily interested in one particular type of question, which is how does politics affect the different types of foreign economic policies that are pursued by our governments. So these policies could include things like trade policy. This would be like tariffs on goods and services. Could be immigration policy, which regulates the flow of labor, flow of people. And it could also be like currency policy, investment policy, which is more so dealing with the flow of capital. So whichever one of these policies we're talking about, if you want to explain why we get the policies that we see, arguably a good place to start is you look at what does the public want? What do citizens want? In democracies, what do voters want? Because I think it's hard to imagine a government, especially in a democracy, that's able to pursue a certain economic policy without mass support from voters. So that's a lot of what I do. My research is looking at survey data, public opinion, digging through the data, and just trying to get a sense of what do voters think when it comes to these policies, and why do they adopt these attitudes? Why do they adopt these preferences? Today, I'm going to focus specifically on immigration as well as refugee policy. So this is, I think, a timely discussion to have, just given current events. And I understand that this is a very polarizing subject nowadays, given current events. So right off the bat, I'll say that I'm not going to give my own takes on what I think the correct or good policies are in this issue area. Maybe the Q&A if you want. But the presentation, I'm going to take more of a scientific approach here. And I'm just simply going to describe for you, this is what voters think on these issues. And I'm going to try to shed light on why they adopt the attitudes that they do. Okay, so that's going to be like the flavor of this presentation. I want to start by discussing what I view as a double standard regarding democracy and immigration policy nowadays. And the double standard is this. So we have this thing called democracy. We all know and love it. Maybe it's not the perfect form of government, but it's probably the best we've got. And I think it's morally, it's much better than the alternative of undemocratic governance. And what is democracy? We could quibble over definitions, but I would say it's accountability to the public through free and fair elections. And it's also the equal protection of basic civil liberties. So these could include things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of protest, as well as due process rights. So right to a fair trial, for instance. So we like this stuff. We like civil liberties. We like democracy. We like it so much that these were the inalienable rights that were enshrined in the Declaration of Independence by the Founding Fathers, and then later tucked into the Bill of Rights in our Constitution. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, if you look at the democracies of today, and not just talk about the US, but I would say democracies worldwide, they tend to not be very good protectors of basic civil liberties when it comes to migrants, in particular asylum seekers and refugees. So asylum seekers, these are people that are fleeing persecution from their home country, and they are seeking temporary protection. This picture, this is a detention center that's actually run by Australia. It's run by the Australian government, and this is where Australia detains migrants that are trying to make their way to Australia. They instead get turned around by boat, and then they get left in this detention center in the country of Papua New Guinea, the PNG, which is a Pacific island just off the coast of Australia. This was a part of Australia's Operation Sovereign Borders, was the slogan for this policy initiative. And I mean, some people like this policy, some people are okay with this, some people don't like this policy. What I will say, though, is that this is unequivocally a violation of international law in the year 2025. And it's a violation of the spirit of democracy, because this is due process rights we're talking about. So these migrants, they are detained against their will, and they're detained without having their case heard in a court, by an immigration court. And it's important to remember that due process rights, and let's just take the United States, for example, the stuff in our Constitution does not just apply to U.S. citizens, it applies to anyone under the jurisdiction of the U.S. government. And that would include migrants as well, documented or undocumented. So this, I think, is a violation, again, of the spirit of democracy. And even worse, if you were to ask voters how they feel about these border enforcement measures, more times than not, voters actually support this stuff. So to give you a sense of some real data to back up that point, here's a question that was asked in a 2013 survey. So it's a little bit dated, but I can assure you the data looks the same today. It's asking this question to voters in 33 advanced industrial democracies around the world. So it's not just the United States that's in the sample. Includes countries in Europe, includes Japan. It's asking the question, what do you think the number of immigrants should be? Or how many immigrants should you let into the country? Increased, decreased, or kept the same? And there's two things to note here. The first is the modal category is most people want to keep the status quo. Most people want to keep borders the same. And that is not an endorsement of open borders, because the advanced industrial democracies of today have very restrictive immigration policies. And it looks like voters are okay with that for the most part. If you take out that middle category, then you'll find that the coalition in favor of closed borders is much greater than the coalition in favor of open borders. So this is a stylized fact that migration scholars know, is that unfortunately, it looks like voters as a whole tend to be very opposed to opening up borders. The answer gets, well, things get even worse if you start talking about undocumented migration, and you talk about measures for trying to crack down on undocumented migrants. Again, the majority of voters, not just in the US, but just democracies worldwide, will tend to agree and support any sort of measures to try to stop the flow of migration. So, I'm not going to explain everything about this chart in the next 50 minutes because I just would need more time than that. But I want to try to shed light on three different questions. So the first is I want to give you at least some answers for what explains this opposition towards an open immigration policy. Because if you look at other foreign economic policies such as trade, you won't find the same opposition. So what is it about migration specifically? I'm also going to touch on to what extent has public opinion changed, if at all, over the past decade or so. We've seen a growing amount of migration, a growing amount of refugee migration, a growing amount of internally displaced persons. Has that in any way changed how people view this issue? And then lastly, I'm going to present a little bit of data to try to get this more kind of narrower question, which is, okay, we've got a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment in democracies nowadays. Is there a way that I can give voters factual but positive messaging, positive information about migrants? And perhaps that could it would force them to change their minds and change their opinion and attenuate this anti-immigrant sentiment that we see. So I'm going to move through this order today to try to address these questions one by one. Very quickly, I'll just give a shout out to some of my co-authors. I'll be using the term we a lot. And when I say we, I'm referring to me and these two other individuals, Brett Besson down in Monterrey, Mexico, professor of political science, and then Ken Stallman at CU Boulder. So they've helped out and been equal contributors to a lot of the data that I'll show you today and a lot of the ideas that I'm about to present to you. So just a shout out to them. I like giving a roadmap, so here's my roadmap. I'm going to start by talking about kind of theory more and just what I think explains a lot of people's attitudes towards immigration. And then I'll get more into the empirical stuff and discuss some survey evidence. Some of it I've been using from existing surveys, and then some of it is survey evidence I've collected myself actually just a few weeks ago. So you'll be the first ones to see this data, I guess, which is nice. But let's start, the next like 5 minutes, I'm not going to talk so much about immigration. I want to start by talking about something called social identities, because these are going to be very important in explaining people's immigration policy attitudes. So what are social identities? I have to pretend I'm a psychologist here. So social identities, this actually comes from psychology. Here's your definition for your convenience. If you want to read this, I put it on the slides. But in plain English, social identities, this is how we perceive, how we define ourselves in relation to other people in society. And by describing a social identity, you're often describing like a group that you feel like you belong to, a social group. This group could be defined on the basis of race, language, religion, gender, partisanship, sports teams. I mean, it's an infinite number of social identities that people can adopt, but this is sort of how we perceive ourselves. It's a self-perception. And I'll show in a moment, this will end up being consequential in driving how we behave and the types of attitudes that we end up adopting. So what are examples of social identities? I will use myself as an example. It's a picture of me. It's not the best one, but it'll do. I have a lot of different social identities. I'll give you a couple. So I was born in the United States. So I was raised in the United States. I feel American. I have a sense of patriotism. When the Olympics comes on, I tend to root for the American athletes. They had the hockey championships yesterday and the United States lost, so I was very sad. So, okay, this is like a social identity that I have. I feel American, however defined. But I'm also a Lyon College faculty member. I'm a part of the Lyon community, and this is something that we all share in this room. Whether you know it or not, maybe just subconsciously, you feel like a part of Lyon. Right? I would say this is actually a type of a social identity. And this identity matters too, because social identities will tend to affect things like who you trust more. And what I would say is, if you were to meet someone like far outside of Arkansas and you learn that they were a Lyon College alumni, I guarantee you would have just inside you like this sense of like, I trust this guy. Like, I feel like I've met this person before, simply because you share this identity. So that's like the power of social identities. There's one more social identity I have. Unfortunately, I'm a New York Rangers fan, so I don't know if there's any hockey fans in here. The last time the Rangers won a championship, the internet wasn't a thing. I was barely alive, so this is unfortunate. But this is a very important social identity because it's the team I root for, and I have a connection with other Ranger fans in Arkansas and around the country, around the world. So there you go. Hopefully, I've given you examples of what social identities are. But these end up mattering for a couple of different reasons. The first is that salient social identities, they tend to draw lines between an in-group and an out-group, an us and a them. And because of that, the social identities that we adopt, it can often bias the types of beliefs and attitudes that we adopt, and it can sort of bias our actions. So I've already kind of named one example of how you tend to trust people more if they're in your in-group, however defined, and you maybe have less trust, and perhaps at the extreme, maybe negative feelings towards people that are in your out-group. So that's where social identities can affect how all of us think in here, consciously or unconsciously. And then also, social identities tend to prescribe certain behaviors over others. So I'll give you a couple examples here. Religion could be a salient social identity for a lot of us in here. And so let's say you're someone who feels Christian. The way you act and the things you believe probably are going to be consistent with Christian values and the idea of being a Christian, however defined. Or if you are, let's say, a Republican, you are probably going to adopt policy preferences that are somewhat consistent with the Republican Party platform. And if you didn't, that's an identity crisis. So you tend to want to adopt and believe things that map on to whatever your social identities are. And so I'm already hinting at how social identities will end up affecting something like immigration preferences. Let me narrow it further. And the two social identities that I've been interested in my research, is first off talking about national identities, but here I'm going to use a little bit more specific term, nationalism. So many Americans have these exclusionary national identities, which is not just about patriotism. It's not just having a strong attachment to your nation, but oftentimes nationalism is about feelings of national superiority. It's a comparative attitude. And so you sort of feel like the U.S. Is not only better than other countries, but you sort of tend to view the world as a competition of sorts. And the U.S. should be striving to win against other nations and other cultures. That's what I mean by nationalism. And I'm going to use the word national identity for the rest of this talk. As you could guess, nationalism tends to associate with more closed immigration attitudes. So this tends to be the coalition against open borders. On the other hand, it's kind of the opposite. There's something called cosmopolitanism. And these are not national identities, these are inclusive world identities. So this would be someone that feels like, okay, maybe I'm American, maybe I'm Canadian, whatever, but I also feel like I'm a human of this world. I don't really care so much about sovereign borders, which are kind of arbitrary anyway. They were just made up over time through history. What I really care about is just humans. So I feel like we share more in common than we differ in humans across the world. And you probably have a sense of moral obligation, not only to help out those in your country, but we should be seeking to solve problems across the globe. I'm not going to play favorites, whether it's happened in the US or elsewhere. A moral obligation owed to all human beings. As you can guess, this cosmopolitanism tends to be associated more with open immigration attitudes and support for open borders and a more humanitarian style refugee policy. Okay, so these are two very important identities that have been kind of established in the migration public opinion literature. And these explain a lot, not just sort of, not just correlating with immigration attitudes, but there's another empirical relationship that you'll notice if you look at survey data, and it's the relationship between education level and immigration policy attitudes. So I'm showing you the same question I showed at the beginning. It's just asking respondents, in this case it's just in the United States, but over a very long time period, what should happen to the number of immigrants to the US? But I'm breaking it down in terms of people without a college degree and people with a college degree or higher. And you'll notice, the difference is pretty stark. The opposition really tends to be people that have not received at least a bachelor's degree and gone to college. And then you go to college, and it's at least a little bit more of a normal distribution. So it seems like more educated citizens in the United States, for whatever reason, have more open immigration attitudes. I can explain this using something like cosmopolitanism, because especially for a lot of Lion College students in here right now, whether you know it or not, as you go to college, you are actually starting to adopt more of these cosmopolitan values and more of a cosmopolitan identity. Because as you go to college, you start to interact with people that are no longer from your hometown. You start interacting people from different regions of the world who speak different languages, who practice different religions, et cetera, et cetera. You may engage in a study abroad program. You may take a class that opens your eyes to new cultures and things you had no idea about. And so as people become more educated, they become more cosmopolitan, and by connection, this happens. So that's the power of these identities, is even through things like education, you become socialized and your identities change over time, which in turn shapes your immigration attitudes. So just to make sure we're all on the same page here, social identities matter. We all have them. National identities of the exclusive variety correlates with anti-immigrant sentiment, and cosmopolitanism correlates with support for open borders. This is pretty uncontroversial in my field. What I've noticed, though, and what other scholars have noticed that have kind of puzzled me, is cosmopolitan identities and national identities, turns out, are not like mutually exclusive. You can have both at the same time. And more often than not, people that feel like they have a strong world identity and feel like world citizenship, they're more likely than not to also strongly identify with their nation. And I'd be willing to guess most of us in this room right now have, to some degree, both of these identities. You feel American, but you also have that cosmopolitan identity as well. So this is what's been noted as an integrated dual identity. You have both of these contemporaneously. There we go. So a round of applause for that one. Okay. So which of these, I'm scratching my head then as I'm looking at this data, like which of these end up mattering more? Because you can only get one policy attitude, right? If you've got two identities, cosmopolitanism and a national identity, which of these is going to drive your immigration attitude? So me and my co-authors got thinking a bit, and we just started kind of telling stories in our head, and I think we settled on, well, maybe context matters. Maybe it depends on kind of different situational cues and different environments where in some situations I may feel or I may kind of think more like a cosmopolitan, and in other situations, under certain circumstances, I might start to think more in terms of my national identity. So let me give you some examples of how context could shape the salience of these different identities. The first example is kind of a funny example, but I believe it works. We'll see. More hockey examples. So again, I understand hockey, I guess, is not a huge thing in Arkansas, so I probably picked the wrong sport here. But in the 70s, I wasn't alive, but in the 70s, I heard there was a team called the Broad Street Bullies. These were the Philadelphia Flyers. They won 2 straight championships, and they did it through literally beating up the other team. I mean, this was a different age, I guess. And, for this reason, their style of play, they were the most hated team in the NHL. And they were especially hated by my father, who's a New York Rangers fan. So he hated the Philadelphia Flyers, would never root for the Philadelphia Flyers. That was his policy attitude towards Philadelphia. However, 2 years later, my dad actually did root for the Philadelphia Flyers, and so did everyone, regardless of what fan you were or what team you were a fan of in the NHL. And it was during a Soviet Red Army game. So there was an exhibition game. The Soviet Union, is during the Cold War, they played the Philadelphia Flyers in an exhibition game. I believe the Soviets just quit because they were getting beat up on by the Flyers, and they forfeited the game. And interesting time, though, because even New York Ranger fans, such as my dad, were rooting for the Flyers. Why is that? I think you know why. It's because, it's the Cold War. It's America's team in this instance versus the Soviets. But really what's happening, it's not that my dad stopped being a Rangers fan and became a Philadelphia Flyers fan. What I would say is there was another social identity, there was national identity. And this swamped out the other identity, which is being a fan of the New York Rangers, at least for a time. And so this is how context can actually shape what you prefer and what you don't prefer. Now I'll give you another more critical example, but similar. The 2000 election, this was Bush-Gore, ended controversially. But okay, after the election, so Bush wins, and very close election. If you polled people in the United States, support for George Bush is probably like in the 50s. If you polled Democrats during this time, I think Bush's approval rating was like in the 20s. And that makes sense because partisan identity will shape, that's a social identity, that will shape attitudes towards your favorability or your preference on like how the president's doing. But you go no more than 2 years later and you get 9/11, and in part because you get 9/11, all of a sudden, if you were to poll Americans, whether it's Republicans, whether it's Democrats, whether it's independents, all of a sudden everyone loves George Bush. Partisan ID no longer matters in September of 2001. Now again, it's kind of obvious why this rally effect happens. It's because you had a huge national security crisis, a terrorist attack. But what that did is it all of a sudden made it so that partisan identity no longer matters as much in the front of people's minds, and no longer are people thinking of themselves as I'm Republican, I'm Democrat. They're more thinking of themselves as I'm American. And I share more in common, even with the Republicans, if you're a Democrat, then I do differ because we're all Americans and we're all in this together. So, I could keep going on about examples about how identities, they're dynamically constructed. They sort of change over time in terms of the identities we rely on to behave and form our attitudes. Now, it's a similar story here with migration. Because when you get a refugee crisis and when you get this large influx of refugees coming into a country, it will, I would say unfortunately, tend to prime national identities over cosmopolitan identities for a variety of different reasons. The first is that many voters, whether it's real or whether it's just perceived, they will at least perceive conflict over scarce resources with this migration coming in. They will view migrants, maybe you've heard these arguments before, migrants as a threat to the native jobs, migrants as a threat to the fiscal resources of the state, migrants taking up seats in classrooms and hospitals. And so what that does, those fears and those anxieties will tend to trigger that us versus them mentality. It will tend to trigger that national identity, and then by connection, immigration preferences will actually become more closed. Right? People will support more rigid border enforcement, for instance. But on top of that, what you'll have during a refugee crisis is, I have here negative elite cues. So these are just information or messages coming from our politicians or from the media that is kind of adding fuel to the fire, so to speak, sort of negative messages about, here are the migrants taking your jobs, here are the migrants contributing to crime, migrants as a threat to national security. And unfortunately, there's too many examples to list here. The easy one, it's almost too easy because the presidential debate, you had the president talk about cats and dogs were being eaten, I believe, right? So eating people's pets. Regardless of the veracity of that, that is a negative elite cue that I think stoked a lot of fear and anxiety, perhaps, in voters. And it's not just Trump saying this, it's other politicians as well that will try to say things that emphasize national identities over other types of social identities. So I'll use another example of a non-US politician. This is the mayor of Bogota. So we're talking about Colombia here. Claudia Lopez, who's actually a politician of the Green Party, which is a leftist party. And during the Venezuelan refugee crisis, she had some not so nice things to say about Venezuelan migrants coming into Colombia, calling them violent, talking about how they want to murder, they want to steal, and again, emphasizing that we need to save things for Colombians. So explicitly mentioning the national identity. And so when you read things like this in the news, if voters are reading these cues coming from our elites, again, what we were trying to argue and what we suspected is that this was going to heighten the salience of national identities and cause immigration attitudes to become closed. So let me show you some evidence of what I've been talking about here. So we'll do something interactive, actually. Does anyone want to take a guess what the top destination or the top receiving country of refugees is nowadays? Which country has the most refugees?
Germany.
Germany. You're actually on the right track. Not Germany, though. Germany's 3. Not France. Not even close.
Turkey.
Oh, no, you're going the wrong direction.
Greece.
You're never going to get it. It's Iran. Iran is number 1. Turkey's number 2. This might change year to year, but Iran and Turkey are definitely 1 and 2. Colombia's 3, so I messed up. Germany's actually 4, and then Pakistan is 5. Yeah, this surprises people because you think that most of the migrations go into the global north countries and like the super developed countries like the United States or Europe. But it's actually these countries, and the explanation's easy. It's an accident of geography. These countries are located to countries that are either at conflict with themselves or a country like Venezuela that, because of the Maduro regime and formerly the Chavez regime, there's a flood of refugees that's leaving Venezuela, trying to escape persecution. And where are they going to go? They're going to go right next door to Colombia because the further you go, the costlier that move is. So the closer you are to where migrants are coming from, the more refugees that you're going to receive. So that's just a side note. So, this is why, no, that's all I'll say. This surprises people, is the U.S. is nowhere near the top receiver of refugees. So what we wanted to do, me and my co-authors, is we wanted to look at places where like a huge refugee crisis happened. And so this was the Venezuelan refugee crisis. And again, most of these refugees end up in Colombia. Peru receives a lot of refugees. And Ecuador as well was number 3, although I think that's changed since this data came out, 2019. But we wanted to look and see not just what public opinion looks like in these areas, but we wanted to see if those social identities were operating differently depending on the country we were talking about. We look at some countries where, like Colombia, that received a ton of refugee migration, and then look at other countries like Uruguay that did not receive as much. So we've used existing survey data. This comes from something called the World Values Survey. And it includes 12 Latin American countries, so we've got a little bit over 13,000 respondents. And this survey has a long list of questions on not attitudes towards immigration policy per se, but attitudes towards immigrants themselves, specifically beliefs. So asking, do you agree or disagree that immigrants increase crime? Do they strengthen cultural diversity? Do they increase risk of terrorism? Et cetera, et cetera. And what we did is, we rescaled these and kind of put them into an index. One measure, one score that goes from 0 to 100, where 100 is the most pro-refugee attitudes and 0 is the most anti-refugee attitudes. This just gives you an idea of how this differs country by country. The country that has the most anti-immigrant sentiment or the least favorable attitudes towards migrants is Colombia. I don't think that is a coincidence. This is the country that by far receives the most migration coming from Venezuela. Peru was number 2, also ranks pretty high in terms of anti-immigrant sentiment. Same for Ecuador. Guatemala, I can't really explain, but what's interesting about Guatemala is they've entered into an agreement with the United States to accept refugees that we don't want here. And I know voters in Guatemala don't want that. So maybe that has something to do with it. I don't know. But notice already there's a pattern, and then you look at a country like Uruguay that hasn't received a ton of Venezuelan refugees. Actually, public opinion is looking pretty good in a place like Uruguay. But we want to know not just what public opinion looks like, but do these social identities end up mattering and explaining differences in public opinion? So we use this question. How close do you feel to the world? It's honestly not the best question, but it was the best that we had to use. So we used this as a rough proxy for one's cosmopolitan identity. Then there was another question dealing with national pride. How proud are you to be Colombian? Prouder to be from Costa Rica, whatever. So this was national identity. So we used both of these questions as proxies for those 2 social identities I've been talking about. This is what we'd expect to find, right? This is what I've been talking about all presentation. These identities, cosmopolitanism will lead to more open attitudes. National identities will lead to more closed attitudes. But we wanted to see if all of a sudden you get a shock that happens, does the role of cosmopolitanism sort of fade away? And then in its place, do you get more of this national identity, predicting more negative attitudes towards migrants? So the graphs I'm going to show you, they're just ways of demonstrating these arrows. And like, is this arrow negative, and how large is this arrow? And same for this. So I'm going to start with cosmopolitanism. Let's start by looking at evidence of this arrow, this green arrow. So this is showing you can think of it as the strength of the correlation between cosmopolitanism and this pro-immigration index or pro-immigrant index. So numbers that are over 0 indicate a positive relationship. Numbers below 0 would indicate a negative relationship. As you'd expect, in most countries, we have a positive relationship. But as you go down to countries like Colombia, like Peru, that have received an exceptionally large increase in refugee migration, the coefficient, that correlation on cosmopolitanism fades to pretty much 0. So in short, we call this fair weather cosmopolitanism, but in short, it looks like cosmopolitan identities, the effect of those tend to weaken precisely when you'd want them to be strong. This just shows you a more of a statistically robust way of plotting this. So again, the effect of cosmopolitanism, positive during normal times, but as you get a rapid influx of migration, it fades to practically 0. What about nationalism, though? So for nationalism, you'd expect a negative effect. You'd expect a negative relationship. And that's what we find in most countries. But again, what happens as refugee migration increases? It's the opposite of cosmopolitanism. National identities don't weaken in their effect on attitudes. They end up strengthening and becoming even more negative. And again, you could plot this just with an actual model and controlling for different things like partisanship and gender and education. And we find the same thing. National identities are strongest precisely when you're in a refugee crisis. So we confirmed, using just kind of observational survey data, a lot of what we suspected with this kind of differing role of identities in predicting attitudes. But we want to see if we could corroborate this with a US sample, and we conducted this survey actually just a few weeks ago. So we got a representative sample of about, I think it was like 1,200, 1,300 Americans across the United States. And we wanted to see this time, not just testing the role of identities, but we actually wanted to see if we provide voters with different messages and information about migrants, migration being good, migration being bad, would this affect their attitudes at all towards, in this case, we're going to look at refugees. And again, we also wanted to see if these messages would differ depending on the strength of one's cosmopolitan identity. So because we got to create this survey ourselves, we ended up asking like a battery of questions. So like, for instance, people have a moral responsibility to help others, even when those in need are located in a foreign country. I view myself as a citizen of the world. So like, we got different questions, put it on a Likert scale, and we made essentially a cosmopolitan index to measure one's cosmopolitan identity. Just some like descriptive data here, because I also thought this was interesting. This is showing you the histogram of the cosmopolitan index, but across American Democrats and American Republicans. And what I wish to kind of show you today is these actually overlap more than you would think. So at least I was thinking before we did the survey, most Democrats are going to be super cosmopolitan, most Republicans are going to be super nationalist or not so cosmopolitan. But in fact, it seems like there's a pretty big overlap between the parties. But let me just kind of take you through the experimental design that we did. So, because I was talking about those messages that we gave our respondents. We actually broke our respondents and broke our sample off into 4 different groups. The first group received nothing. We only asked them questions about how they feel about refugees. We didn't give them any information. We didn't give them any messages on refugees being good or bad. We had a second group, though, where we gave them really a purely just informational stuff on the increase in refugees coming to the United States during the Biden administration. And these are real numbers, so we've confirmed this. This is real data, and we were trying to just describe how migration, specifically refugee migration and undocumented migration, has been increasing. And we would see by giving people that information, does that maybe water down their cosmopolitan identity, like it did in the Latin America sample. For a third and fourth group, though, in addition to that message, we gave them a positive message about migration. That was group 3. And then group 4 got instead a negative message about migration. So, these are common arguments that you'll hear, not just from American politicians, but politicians worldwide will
maybe they'll talk about migrants taking away jobs, for instance, or consuming social services. You'll also hear people defending migrants saying, well, no, they actually pay taxes. In that case, they strengthen the government budget. So we were trying to replicate that. We wanted to provide these different cues to see if that would change their attitudes and to see if that would maybe reshape the role of cosmopolitanism. So here's the good part, the good finding. What we found is you want to compare it to the control group that received nothing. Because all these groups, they're the same on average. The only difference is the message that we gave them. So if you compare it to people that received nothing, no message at all, it looks like the positive messaging seems to work. So it pushes people to say, oh, well, actually, I feel pretty positive about refugees, at least more positive than the control group. The negative message went down a little bit, but these little whiskers here, this just shows you the confidence interval. So it's not statistically significant. It's not really we don't have enough confidence that these are different from one another. So really the only effect that we found is it looks like positive messaging actually can work. I'm sure there's some policy implications there, but yeah, it is possible to move immigration attitudes by giving information. Attitudes are malleable in that sense. Now here's the not so good finding in that we were able to replicate to some extent what we found in Latin America. This is showing you not the average score on that pro-refugee index. This is showing you the average effect of cosmopolitanism. So it's always going to be greater than 0 because I've told you that cosmopolitanism leads to more open immigration attitudes. But what happens to the role of that identity? Compared to the control group, if you feed even cosmopolitans negative information about immigration, it tends to water down that identity. So, like I said, this actually corroborated what we found in the World Values Survey when looking at Latin America. So it doesn't seem to be something that's specific to that region. You can find some evidence of this fair weather cosmopolitanism in the United States as well. So, kind of just some takeaways to wrap things up. So what explains voter attitudes toward immigration? A lot of things. But what we were after, I think a lot of where the action is these different social identities, nationalism, cosmopolitanism. 2, to what extent has growing mass migration changed public opinion towards immigration and toward refugee policy? I think unfortunately, the traditional supporters of an open immigration policy are kind of fair weather because anti-immigrant sentiment not only goes up, but those cosmopolitan identities tend to matter less, precisely when you'd want them to be strong. And then 3, this is our positive finding. Can positive messaging attenuate anti-immigrant sentiment? I think it can. We did find some evidence of this. We do plan to run an experiment again, so we want to tweak some things. But at the same time, this is kind of the more pessimistic finding of today. Is this one thing that was really thought to be this part of the population that's thought to be defenders of open borders. Turns out these things don't end up mattering as immigration inflows increase. So, I'm sure that gives you a lot of food for thought. I'm happy to answer whatever questions you have, though. Thank you.
Cool. Hey, thank you. I was thinking about the concept of identity. So like you have religion, culture, language, for example. So in your survey instrument, did you have anything to capture out in terms of your theory that people also put different weights? Sometimes my language is more important than my religion or my culture.
Yeah.
And it can change from time to time. So when you conducted those surveys in other countries, did you have any tool to control the socioeconomic conditions in those countries, like in Peru or Colombia? Were they going through any economic crises or other problems that aggravated or changed their attitude, how they put those weights in, say, for example, in those 3 criteria?
Yeah, most of our controls were at the individual level. We were accounting for someone's personal economic situation through things like income, education. we didn't control for well, actually, no, we did. We control for things like development and GDP growth at the country level. So maybe that's also what you're referring to.
Yes.
But most of our controls were trying to hold constant things like partisanship. I don't think we had it measured for religious identity or anything like that. But yeah, partisanship, income, education, gender, maybe a couple other things.
Sorry, but you did not have anything to capture the weights. People can, obviously, we put different weights on different elements of our identity. They are not static, they are not equally divided. As I'm saying that sometimes, I'm originally from Bangladesh, sometimes I feel like I'm a Bengali, right? Sometimes I feel that, I'm an American. So that weight, how we put, that can vary, that can change over time.
Yeah, in part, I think that's what we're trying to measure here too,
Difficult.
But yeah, that would be picked up by, yeah, it'd be cool if we had different questions to get at all these different identities. We can only control for what was directly measured in the survey, but it's an interesting point, yeah. Jason?
Yeah, I was just wanted to build off of that because countries in South America like Uruguay have had successes with development. IMF and World Bank funding has been exceptionally well perceived and successful there. Do you have some correlations with the positive and negative downsides of international development with your cosmopolitan index? It would seem to me Uruguay would be more likely to view themselves as cosmopolitan because of the successes of international development, while Colombia, even absent the aspects, has had a lot of international involvement in politics that might make them be more national.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, we do control for development, but what is interesting is if you look at Chile and Uruguay, oops, this one, right, they are more developed economies. There are richer economies. I think that ends up mattering not only because it might affect one feeling cosmopolitanism, which we directly measure, but I also think richer economies are going to have just a greater capacity to accept refugees in a sustainable way. So even though these countries have not accepted maybe as much refugees as say Colombia, by virtue of being more developed, they've also just been able to, I guess, have a more positive experience in bringing refugees in because they just have the capacity to deal with the situation, right? It's a logistical thing, right? Dealing with all these refugees coming in, getting them settled, getting them working. These countries arguably have more of a capacity to do that than say a poor country like Bolivia. But yeah, I agree though. I mean, cosmopolitanism, we haven't actually directly looked at that, but I'd be willing to guess it is going to be higher in some of these countries than others. Yeah. Stephanie, and then Radek, I saw his hand was up for a while.
No, just with the Southern Cone, Argentina and Uruguay, they both historically have more experience with accepting migrants. I mean, not necessarily outside the European descent, but I just wonder what effect that might have too, just their history of 19th century and heavy migration.
Yeah, being a country that was founded on immigration. Yeah, there's some I don't know if I'd call them economists or historians, but there's this distinction between settler nations, which are could be Argentina, could be the United States, could be Australia, that were they had a history of being labor scarce and just not a ton of people there, and they were settled by Europeans, and so maybe that leads to a melting pot culture that is more cosmopolitanism. So I think there's some evidence of that. And then you compare that to countries in Europe that don't have those same experiences, and you will tend to find that anti-immigrant sentiment will be higher than in places like France, Japan, certainly, that don't have that same experience. So yeah, you're probably onto something there. Radek, your hand was up for a while.
So this is basically a cross-section of countries and then a cross-section of individuals within each country.
Yeah, it's a multi-level model, yeah.
Right, so during this time period, I didn't quite catch the relevant time period, but are most of the refugees Venezuelans? Or is there, what is the proportion of Venezuelans?
Haitians too, but a large majority is Venezuelans, yeah.
So, but you don't control in any way for the identity of the refugees themselves, just the recipient country?
No, I don't think we
Maybe some
have that.
cultural distance between the countries, because for example, for Poland, I think a lot of this will play out opposite because of with the Ukrainians, because of the cultural connections. Right.
Yeah, I disagree that cultural distance matters as much as you think it does maybe, but we don't measure it here. I mean, the only data we could get is aggregate refugee flows at 5-year intervals, but it doesn't account for nationality, to my knowledge. Maybe I need to double check.
You don't know who the refugees are essentially.
Well, I can say confidently most of them are Venezuelans. I just can't give you a number. Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, circling back to the development question. I know you mentioned GDP, but what ways are you not defining, measuring development, and in what ways are you controlling for it within the study? Just out of curiosity.
We just use GDP per capita,
Okay.
which is pretty standard. Yeah, GDP per capita, and like I said before, controlling for people's personal economic situation as well, the individual level. Mark?
When you say negative messaging, positive messaging, do you give them data? Like, are jobs actually increasing? Are they actually taking jobs? Right? And then that changes, pretty quickly. But do you give specifics so people know actually the facts?
We debriefed them at the end of the experiment to let them know. We actually I don't know if they ended up clicking the links and reading all the stuff we gave them, but we gave them that information at the end of the experiment. I think the purpose here, though, what we were trying to do is just to try to paint a positive story, paint a negative story, that we often see this language and this narrative employed by politicians. Right? We weren't trying to throw numbers at them necessarily. I mean, we did that here, but we're more just trying to, what if we tried to paint a negative story, paint a positive story, and to see if that would maybe change things at all. But maybe we could add in some numbers and statistics. I'd have to think about it. Yeah, Scott?
So I'm just wondering about refugees. So it seems to me one of the difficulties in a place like the United States, we have such a complex immigration system that probably most Americans don't know the difference. I'm not trying to say that they don't know the difference between temporary protected status. They don't understand the difference between humanitarian parole. So if you say refugees, for many Americans, they just lump everybody into one big basket of, okay, these people come across the border, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
So just wondering, a refugee is a very specific, rigorous status. It's
Yeah.
actually super hard to get.
Yeah.
So if people actually knew what these people had to prove to be a refugee, would that, so it kind of goes into the definitional kind of thing too, if you define what a refugee is and what the actual criteria were, even without trying to have a positive message, if you even just tell them what a refugee is, which I think most Americans are clueless,
Yeah.
what actually is that status? How do you get it? Would that make a difference? I don't know.
Yeah, let me think. If people knew what a refugee was, because they probably don't. I think most Americans would say refugees are the same as undocumented migrants, which is not true. We were just doing a broad net here to cover not just refugees, but asylum seekers as well.
It wasn't so much a critique, it was just sort of the observation.
Yeah. No, I mean, support would probably be higher if they had an understanding what refugees were, especially since there's a humanitarian case there. So we could think about different messages we could give voters. And, we could be here all day, I think, talking about ways we could maybe try to sway public opinion. But yeah, maybe that's one thing, is just to describe what is a refugee. Probably would get some action there, yeah.
You mentioned the relationship between education and cosmopolitanism. Was there a difference between educated and uneducated, in the strength? You talked about the fair weather cosmopolitanism. Is there a difference between education there?
I honestly don't know. I would have to look. I know education is still a significant determinant. Even controlling for these identities, education always seems to predict more open immigration attitudes. But beyond that, would have to check the data.
I have two questions. One is more informative. So kind of in the beginning you talked about that nationalism and I can't say that, but
I couldn't pronounce words
Right,
today either, it's
exactly.
okay.
So those two, you also mentioned middle people who would have both situations, right? But if we were to look at the whole world population, is there like any study even to like estimate how many are in fact going to be really world citizen, like sort of like that kind of people? Because I would imagine that would be very little compared to the nationalism.
Yeah. You're probably right. Again, I don't have exact numbers to give, but that would be my guess is national identities tend to be more prevalent than cosmopolitan identities. And it may be the case, like Jason mentioned before, maybe cosmopolitanism is also some element to do with development, and so maybe you're likely to find in certain societies compared to others. But yeah, I mean, my guess is nationalism is probably more prevalent, and I mean, that's why anti-immigrant sentiment tends to be, it's like, it's not a purely global north thing, it's not a purely American thing. I mean, you'll find it almost anywhere you go. And therein lies the problem. It's like, if you're gonna be a democracy that supports the rights of asylum seekers, you almost have to get rid of democracy to do that, because most of the public doesn't wanna do these things. That's kind of the puzzle here.
Right. So the other question I had kind of related after that. So towards the end, like the very last figure you showed, it showed like how the like the world citizen kind of people, like how they changed their attitude towards like the positive message, change it and all that. So basically, I'm wondering, like, no, it's actually the one before that, like the negative effect really made a big deal about like how they decide things. So from that, I'm wondering, if you're a world citizen, more likely you're very easy, like, you know, you're easy to be pushed over because you're kind of a person who would be tolerant to other people and stuff like that. So would that have an effect on how you think about something too? Like, you know, like your attitude might be like easy to change based on what you hear and what you don't. Like, you know what I mean? Like, if you're given a negative message and now you are also, like, you're also thinking it pretty cosmopolitan way, like world citizen kind of way, and then you're already like a nicer person. No, I mean, I wouldn't say nicer person, but you're like more open-minded person.
Yeah.
So would that have to do with it? I thought so, looking at your data, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, you're kind of hinting to it. Some sort of measurement error, because if they're afraid to disagree with statements, for instance, that could shape maybe the way they're answering questions. But I'd have to think about it more, though. I mean, why are they more likely to change their minds during a time of heightened migration compared to normal times? I guess I'm still, maybe cosmopolitans are more malleable in their attitudes, but we're still finding, they tend to drop those open attitudes precisely when you'd want them to have them. So, yeah.
So I think this is probably pretty obvious, but does the Cosmopolitan Index, does it track really well with population density?
Yep. So more urban voters, which is another thing we control for, by the way. But yeah, you'll find more cosmopolitanism in urban areas. Yep. Yeah, but one more.
Are countries with lower birth rates more accepting of migrants?
No, because the countries with lower birth rates are going to be mostly Europe, Japan, and especially a country like Japan and most of Europe, they're not generally accepting of migrants. So, yeah, that'd be my answer.
Well, I hope you'll hang around, have a cookie, have a drink, and talk to Dr. Connell a little bit more. Thanks for coming.
Oh, thank you. I really enjoyed it. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.